Hi, I'm Jim Brett, President and CEO of the New England Council. Thanks for tuning in to our July episode of Inside the Corner Office, where we catch up with the leaders of some of our region's most well-respected businesses and organizations to learn more about their career paths and about the institutions they lead. This month, my guest is Bill Doyle, co-founder and executive chairman of an incredible company called Novocure, headquarters in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Novocure has developed a truly remarkable and innovative technology that treats cancer by using electrical fields to shrink tumors. Bill shares his impressive career history, as well as the story of Novocure's founding and growth here in New England. We also talked about the region's incredible innovation ecosystem and how Novocure is working to ensure that patients have access to the life-saving technology. As always, I thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. Bill, thanks very much for taking the time to join me today. I'm thrilled to meet you and excited to learn more about Novocure. You truly have had an incredible career, culminating with your current role at Novocure. But let's start talking a little bit about your path. You're an engineer by training. What prompted your interest in pursuing a career in engineering?
Well, so when I was a kid, I was on the trajectory to be a carpenter. My parents, my dad's from Boston, my mom's from Brookline. He's, they say, when both were alive, they say they had a mixed marriage because all her family were firemen and all his family were policemen. But in my high school, I got involved in science fairs like some kids do. And one thing led to another, and I won the international science fair when I was in high school. So, the first, the regional, the national, and then the international. And when that happens, everybody starts telling you should go to MIT. That's kind of the advice that you get. And
You did.
Next thing you know, I went to MIT. There are two reasons I think that I studied engineering. One was because I needed a job afterwards. So as great as it was to go to MIT there are a lot of interesting things to study there, but the sure thing to get a job is to become an engineer. But more on a more interesting side, I studied material science, which is the study of it's basically solid state physics and chemistry. And I picked that major because, quite frankly, it was the most interesting to me among the engineering fields because it was the closest to basic science. And so it's kind of as simple as that. I was an undergrad at MIT. I stayed on in the graduate program. It wasn't, MIT is not one of these places that you love every minute of the day while you're there. It's not obviously a football school or, we had some fun, but, a party school. But I've never, ever looked back and thought that I wasted my time at MIT. It was a rigorous preparation, really, for everything that I've done, subsequently.
But you spent most of your career in the medical device sector. Can you walk us through your very impressive career path?
Well, again, there's a lot of people who have done a lot of good things. So I hate it when people say it was impressive. But I actually started in the electronics area. When I was at MIT, I developed, when I was a grad student, if you remember the Timex Indiglo wristwatch, the lamp inside that watch that lights up when you press the button, I developed that while I was a grad student. And that is technology now is in every automobile, all your light up switches. But after doing that, starting the company and working with partners, the technology was ultimately went to 3M, and they did the big commercialization work. I realized that that's what I really enjoyed, was not doing just the science, but doing the practical work of bridging the work that's done in the lab to actually get to people. And so I thought that I needed a little business training, and ended up going to Harvard Business School. So MIT, a few years as a sort of do-it-yourself entrepreneur, and then I went to HBS. And a lot of people in the healthcare field have a story like this. But while I was at HBS, my mom got very sick. She was diagnosed with cancer, and it was a cancer, it was melanoma that they couldn't do much for. And she passed away. And at that time, I said, okay, I'm gonna take whatever I've got to offer, and I'm going to apply it in the healthcare world. I knew I knew a lot about science, and I could really figure out science. I didn't know a lot about biology at the time, but I knew I could get on top of very difficult material. But I also knew that I could bring that forward and get it beyond just the lab to the market. And so from Harvard, I went from sort of the electronics industry to healthcare. And I did that, I call it my grad school, but I went to Johnson & Johnson. So went from being, really a do-it-yourself entrepreneur to one of the biggest, if not the biggest, healthcare company in the world. And I got lucky, which sometimes happens out of a place like Harvard Business School, and got in a position where I had a pretty big job pretty early. So they were really looking for someone to help them. They had many different divisions in medical technology, and these are names that doctors will know: Ethicon, DePuy, Synthes, and they needed someone to really coordinate all the R&D across all those divisions, and to coordinate the business development, or the external looking technology acquisition. And I managed to land in that job. And so, it was a big company, a lot of resources. I learned a lot, but I also had the privilege of, I wasn't working in the basement of J&J. I was working in a position where I was looking out, and had the opportunity to travel all over the world, looking at new technologies and looking at those that we should bring into J&J. This was at the time that the cardiac stents had been licensed into J&J and were developed inside J&J. We actually did I think maybe the one and only hostile takeover that J&J's ever did, when we took over the Cordis Corporation to bring balloons and angioplasty supplies together with our stents. So it was great graduate school, and that's was sort of the foundational period of my time in medical technology.
So how did you connect with the founder of Novocure, Professor Pelty?
So yeah, this was the direct result of what I just described. So one of the areas that I spent a lot of time working on was back in the field of cardiac medicine. And I think, we all know that our heart is a pump, and it has a plumbing system and electrical system. And when the plumbing goes bad, you get a stent, or you get a surgery to replace the arteries, the so-called cabbage procedure. Or again, if the valves go bad, you get replacement valves. When the electrical system goes bad, there's a whole different suite of therapies. One that most people are familiar with is the pacemaker. That's if your heart is getting its electrical signals so that it's not pumping fast enough. One of the early inventions was a little, we called them cans, but a little can, some electrodes that pace the heart, give an electrical signal so that the heart beats appropriately. Turns out that's just one problem with the electrical system. there's a whole host of problems where that heart gets intermittent electrical frequency, sometimes too fast, sometimes too slow, and then sometimes too fast, sometimes extra beats. And this is treated with the field that's called electrophysiology. And this is now ancient history, but in the early 90s, doctors, electrophysiologists had a very difficult time figuring out what was going on, causing these aberrant electrical systems and these unusual heartbeats. Professor Palti, MD, PhD at the Technion in Israel, came up with a way to make this very easy for electrophysiologists. And it had two parts to it. One was an ability to put a catheter inside the heart and then make an electrical map of what was going on electrically inside the heart. And then number two, once it was identified where the problem with that electrical signal was, to be able to put in a second catheter and go back to the exact same spot and make what's called an ablation, or a little burn that could fix that. And then the patients, literally, this was one of these procedures where you went into the procedure with a problem. If you put the burn in just the right place, you get off the table and the problem is fixed. So Palti came up with a way to make that easy. That's called the Biosense now company. They make a technology system that they call CARTO, consisting of the catheters. And I acquired that from Palti in the mid-90s when there was no revenue. It was an idea. I remember still at the time, we paid about $450 million for it, which today sounds almost like small change, but it was unheard of for a company with no revenue. Brought it into J&J. My reward for doing this deal was I had to become the first internal CEO of the company. I actually moved to Israel for a while, in Haifa, to get it going, to get it integrated into J&J. And I don't follow it exactly, but I understand now that the internal revenue at J&J, it's about $6 billion a year, by far and away the most successful medtech company in Israel, within J&J. But a few years later, this is a long story to your question, Jim. Yeah. Palti called me and said, "It's another idea." And this one was so successful, so important. I assumed it was another cardiac idea, but we literally sat down in 2000 over lunch at a restaurant in Tel Aviv, and he sketched out on this is literally true, on a napkin, this idea for treating cancer using the electrical properties of cells rather than their chemical properties as a way to treat solid tumors. So it was through J&J, through Biosense. This one was so far out, I couldn't get J&J to bite, because everything ultimately is a consensus, and you can't do anything alone. But I was so naive, really, but so interested that was the point I left J&J, and I joined with Professor Palti and an early team in Israel to commercialize this idea. And I say now, so this is 24 years later, that I had the naivete and the hubris that, one, I knew what an electric field was. So that was a plus, because the whole electroluminescent technology, the Timex Indiglo technology, was based on applying electric fields to wide gap semiconductors to make that light. So I knew what an electric field was. And I was so naive, I assumed about 5 years. We get this developed, we change the way cancer was treated, and I could go on and do something else. So 24 years later, we're still working on the second half of that.
It's truly amazing that all of this came from a little laboratory in the basement of a home in Haifa. It's just remarkable. Speaking of this technology, in layman's term, how does that technology work?
Sure, absolutely. So let me go back to, what's an electric field? Because in physics, we describe applying force at a distance as a field. So if you have the classic example is a pool table. If one pool ball hits another pool ball, it shoots off in the opposite direction. That's easily understood to transfer force. At a distance, it's a little more conceptual, but we're all familiar with gravity, right? That's Newton's apple falling, and that is the result of a gravitational field. As kids, we all played with magnets, so we're all very familiar with what a magnetic field is. You have your nail and your magnet, and as they get close, the nail is pulled to the magnet. That's a magnetic field. An electric field is analogous, but this is the force that when you have a positive charge and a negative charge, they'll be pulled together. And conversely, if you have two positive charges and you attempt to put them together, they're repulsed. So that's the force field created by electrical charges. So now if I go to biology, when a cell divides, and cells, have all these different shapes, but when they divide, they round up generally into a ball. In the middle, there's a nucleus that has a membrane around it. That membrane dissolves, and the famous chromosomes, the 23andMe chromosomes, line up in the middle of the cell, and that's the DNA. And then a structure called the spindle self-assembles, and we've seen these pictures of cells. This is the structure that attaches, and it has to attach precisely to the 23 points on each side of the DNA, and it pulls it apart into the daughter cells. That's how one cell becomes two cells with identical genetic material. It turns out the proteins that make up the spindle, the tubulin, have a very high electrical charge. So Palti's idea was as simple as this. Instead of this happening, if I can get that electric field into the cell, which is easier said than done, instead of this happening, we can make this happen, make them so they don't line up, and then instead of that cell dividing, it will die. So instead of one becoming two, two becoming four, one dies. So that's the first part. The second part is, okay, how do I get this field into, first, how do I make it? And then how do I get it just into the cancer cells? It turns out the way that we create this field is with a medical device, unprecedented medical device, but a device that consists of, first of all, a box that generates the fields. This is a home use wearable device that the patient will have in a backpack or a purse or on a belt. That is connected to patches that go on the skin outside in the area of the tumor. I always do this because the first tumor we've been working on is glioma, GBM, the deadly brain cancer. So a patient with GBM will shave his or her head, put the patches on, and then we tune the electric field to the right frequency so that it only goes into the cancer cells. And the way I explain this, back to layman's terms is your car radio, right? We all are experienced with our car radio. We talk about tuning the radio. And in the old days, you and I probably remember, tuning was really, there was a knob on that radio that you turn. That was tuning. What that did was allow, in the air, there are all the frequencies, all the radio stations, and each one of those numbers, 98 Rock, DC 101, those are not random numbers. Those are frequency, megahertz numbers. And as you tune that radio, it lets one of those frequencies in. So instead of getting, a garble of, 100 radio stations, one frequency gets in and you hear your radio station. It turns out those cell membranes are tuners, and only one frequency at a time can get into one type of cell. So we tune our box to treat glioma, to treat pancreatic cancer, to treat ovarian cancer. And none of those frequencies will damage the normal healthy cells. They're at different frequencies if we wanted to kill them. So, so with our medical device, we tune the electric fields, we deliver them through our patches, they get into the cancer cells, and they rearrange the spindle, and those cancer cells die. So that's the technology in kind of a from beginning to end in layman's terms.
So impressive. You know, I know that Novocure is somewhat unique among the medical device companies in terms of the level of direct engagement with patients. Can you explain the process once a patient is prescribed your treatment and what the patient experience looks like?
Sure. So, you know, for those of us in the lab, you know, informally in the lab, you know, we always think that the most important aspect is inventing the technology. And in some respects, that's true. Without that invention, you know, you don't have anything. But to get it to patients, you have to get it approved by the FDA. That's a process. Then you have to get someone to pay for it, right? You know, and this is the work we do with payers. So this is, you know, insurance companies, it's CMS, you know, the Medicaid, Medicare, Medicaid.
Services.
And then you have to get doctors to prescribe it. And finally, you have to get patients to use it. You know, so the invention is just the beginning of these technologies. And so when something is brand new, I always say there are privileges of being a pioneer, but there's also a lot of steep hills. And in this case, because no doctor ever studied this in medical school, it's happening now, but you know, when we got started, they had no idea how to use it, how to prescribe it. And you know, as much as doctors are interested in innovation, they're also very busy. And you know, it's a tough job because you're seeing patients, you're trying to stay on top of new things. You're also, you know, trying to get the economics of your practice to work. So I decided that the best approach here was to take as much of that burden away from the doctor as possible. So the doctor still has to understand the technology. They still have to prescribe it. But from that moment, and this gets to your question about the patient experience, we receive the prescription and we take it from there. So we will then arrange with I'll use brain cancer as the example, with the brain cancer patient and their caregiver, which, you know, is very often a family member, could be a husband, wife, kid. Sometimes it's a nurse. We will make an appointment, you know, as quickly as possible. We have a group of technicians that will, it's almost, I like to say it's like you know, my technicians don't always like this, but like your Best Buy technicians. You get a new home theater, you know, somebody comes to set it up, and then they have to teach you how to use the remote control. None of this is that difficult, but the first time for everything, you know, you need somebody to walk you through it. So we go to the patient's house, we teach them everything they need to know about using the machine that I just described. We provide 24/7 support, and we actually come back once a month. We download all the files from the device to make sure that the patient has been using it properly. So we not only teach them, but we help them along the way, and we provide any coaching that they may need. We also do things because there is a battery charger here. You know, we have patients, and there's just some beautiful examples, you know, of, you know, one woman who wanted to do a cross-country bicycle trip. So our team, and they take great pride in this, made sure that there were supplies stationed along the routes of her trip, so she didn't have to carry all the junk with her as she went. But we essentially provide all the device support that the patient may need. along their, what we call the patient journey.
So how
And
many
that way,
patients?
it's good
Yeah.
for
Go ahead.
it's good for the patient, but it's also good for the doctor. So, the doctor doesn't get a call in the middle of the night. The red light went on.
Mhm.
I dropped the battery in the pool. All those kinds of technical questions. Doctors don't like those, and we can take care of all that stuff.
So how many patients has Novocure worked with since this treatment has been made available, and then more importantly, what kind of outcomes do patients typically see?
Yeah, so the round number is so we received our FDA approval for newly diagnosed glioblastoma at the very end of 2015. So we started commercial operations in newly diagnosed GBM really in the beginning of 2016. We've also, in addition to receiving approval in the US, we've received European approval. We've received approval in Japan. In fact, to my knowledge, we're still the only therapy that's been approved in Japan without the requirement for a Japanese, what they call a bridging trial, where the Japanese typically require, great, you've done it in the US, but we want to see it work in Japanese patients too. They waive that requirement for our technology. And we're approved in China, Canada, Israel, Switzerland, some countries that have separate regulatory process. And so since that time in 2016, we've treated approximately 35,000, every week it's greater, commercial GBM patients. We've also treated a large number in the clinical setting of lung cancer patients, ovarian cancer patients, and pancreatic cancer patients, which are the cancers where we're going next. The second part of your question was asking about what improvement have we seen. So again, I'll start with brain cancer, where we have the most information. And doctors measure this a lot of different ways. They're what we call median overall survival. But from the patient's perspective, I always think the most important number is the 5-year survival, because when you go into that office and you're going to select a therapy, you want to know what are my chances. And in our case, without our therapy, the 5-year outlook for a patient diagnosed with this form of brain cancer, and by the way, this is the most common brain cancer, aren't great. The 5-year survival is in the low single digits, 2%, 3%, 4%, 5-year survival. In our case, we raised that to about 15%. So, let's call it a 3x improvement, but that's for all patients. What we see, though, is I said that for our therapy to work, it's got to be used and on. So we see better outcomes depending on how many hours a day the patients use it. They get an improvement if they use it at least 12 hours a day. But if they get up to 18, 19, 20, that number, the 15% number gets to be almost double that. So you go from, I'll make the math easy, from 5% to, 25, 30% chance. So you really have a good chance at a 5-year survival. And we're doing a lot of things. One of the, the most exciting things about our work that we have ongoing, and I always like to brag here that we're one of the medical device companies that spends the highest percentage of our revenue on R&D. Last year, it was about $200 million that we spent on R&D. It averages around 35%. So as I said, we're among the highest. So we're working to increase the amount of energy that we can bring in with our patches. And we see the possibility to raise that 25% 5-year survival dramatically by improving the amount of energy we deliver. We're also working on combining it with other therapies, in particular immunotherapy, where we see when we combine tumor treating fields, which is what we call our therapy, with immunotherapies, we get a result that's much better than either alone. And that's really the foundation from taking it from 25%, to 50% to 75%, and really changing the game for these patients with these really difficult solid tumors. And that's work that's ongoing. We have a phase 3 clinical trial that we're doing in cooperation with Merck right now for combining our therapy with their drug Keytruda in newly diagnosed GBM. We're doing another trial with Roche with their immunotherapy in pancreatic cancer, where we're combining them. And I think this is really the next frontier, is this combination of our therapy and immunotherapy in these really tough to treat cancers.
Why don't you take a minute to brag about your new flagship building in Portsmouth?
So my very good friend, fellow MITer, Chris Sununu, says there's two kinds of people, and he calls them the lucky and the smart. And the lucky were born in New Hampshire, and the smart moved to New Hampshire. So I wasn't lucky.
Yeah.
I was born in upstate New York.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe I'm not that smart because it was late in life. But I have now moved to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I do a lot of work with a gentleman you may know, have heard of, Dean Kamen, who is building tremendous biotech, medtech complex in Manchester. I'm actually sitting in one of his mills right now. If you see the bricks in back here, I'm in one of the mills in Manchester, where I have an office.
Is that the mill yard?
I'm in the mill yard right now.
Right. I know where it is. Yeah.
But in addition to everything that's going on in the mill yard, we wanted to create and I believe this. If you think of Silicon Valley, the distance from like Santa Clara to San Francisco is about 50 miles. If you put a pin in MIT and then go up about 50 miles, you get Portsmouth, you get Manchester. You have to stretch a little more to get to Hanover, but you get to Hanover. And while I believe that Cambridge will maintain its position as really the biotech center of R&D around MIT, around Harvard, all the R&D, it's not necessarily the best place to do manufacturing of all of this technology. It's not necessarily the best place to do training for no other reason than traffic. I mean, let's pick that as, and I'm not here to, poo-poo Cambridge, but there are challenges, right? With all that density. I think New Hampshire, with its business climate, little more geographic spread, is a natural extension to that biotech valley. And that's what we're taking advantage of. It's a wonderful place. Portsmouth is a place where we can bring doctors to be trained. People want to work in Portsmouth, so we can recruit from all over the world, and we're accessible from my home in Portsmouth, depending on the time of day. But I can be at Logan faster than I could be at JFK when I lived in New York City. I've got Manchester Airport, I've got Portland Airport, we've got the Pease Jetport. I sound like I'm with the Chamber of Commerce of
No, that's great.
Portsmouth. Yeah. But it's fantastic. And then I'm also an hour away from Manchester, which is, I think, being recreated as, Manchester is interesting. It was the largest manufacturing center in the world, on the Merrimack River. Right? So you had Manchester, Lowell, all of these big water-powered textile towns all went into decline. And through the work of Dean Kamen, really his leadership, Manchester has the ambition to be now the biotech and medtech manufacturing center that that Manchester was in the turn of now 2 centuries ago. And it's happening. It really is happening. And in Portsmouth, with the Pease Jetport and everything that I just mentioned, it's kind of a natural place for us. But again, for a flagship where we want to bring in doctors, we want to bring in prospective employees, we want to bring in patients, it's still a little nicer than Manchester in terms of, wanting to come and spend a few days and walk around. So that's why we're there.
Well, I think you've given a reason to say that, Boston's not just the biotech hub, but New England. New England is the innovation ecosystem, and an example is, to the north of Boston and Portsmouth, and I think it's a great example. I was surprised to learn that it took 8 years.
Jim, I'll make one more point on this.
Sure.
I'm just finished. I couldn't agree more. If I drive 50 miles south, I get to Providence, and I think the whole area around Brown and the old jewelry warehouses and all of that. I think that's going to be biotech south, by the way. So even though I'm a New Hampshire guy now, a transplanted granite stater, I think that's all going to happen in Rhode Island as well.
I think you're right, and the governor.
Okay, I interrupted you.
No, I'm sorry. No, the governor of Rhode Island has made a major emphasis in putting some substantial amount of dollars to just what you said about a biotech health facility down there, and with Brown University being one of the key components to make it happen. So you're right. I was surprised to learn that it took 8 years after the tumor treating field technology was approved by the FDA for Medicare to cover that treatment, and that such a long delays are not uncommon for medical devices. And I thought I read somewhere that if you look at other countries, it could take maybe 11 months, and here it could take 4.5 years, and on average. Can you just talk about that, and more importantly, how does that impact the patients?
Sure. Yeah, it's a real issue. When a lot of the policies were created around how we pay for novel therapies, they were created with drugs in mind. And the world of devices was considered less advanced, and it was thought of as the world of canes and commodes and wheelchairs and beds. Quite frankly, the policies didn't anticipate very advanced therapies that would come from, I always say, come from a box instead of come from a bottle. So they just don't exist in this country. And in our case, patients in Japan, patients in Germany had access to our therapy long before they did in the US, simply because there's not even a pathway at CMS. And, I don't want to, because I could, spend a lot of time just complaining about the system that we have, rather than describe that is the system that we have. And I think we need to call it modernize, because now we do see, and it's not just our therapy, but therapies for diabetes, therapies for chronic kidney disease, some of the most difficult therapies for congestive heart failure that are going to be device-based, not just drug-based. And what happens is, first of all, for companies like, the one that I've been so integral with, Novocure, it's made it extremely difficult. But it's also the opposite. Companies that will never be founded, will never be financed, because the venture capitalists of this world, rightly say, gee, I can finance development. I know how to do that. I can finance regulatory because I know how to do that. But even if I do that successfully, then I hit a dead end with payment. And so investors can't invest into these technologies. Again, I talked about my naivete. So I invested in it and then, banged my head against the wall for 8 years. But what we really need are is a modernization, and there's a recognition of that. I think there is bipartisan initiatives in Washington to modernize the pathway to reimbursement for medical technology. It's not there yet, but there is legislation that, as I said, it's bipartisan, because this is not a I hope a partisan issue. And again, we have great support to get this so that CMS will be required to create a pathway for these advanced medical devices. But the simple bullet points are: one, it doesn't exist now. So companies like ours have no assurance that in any reasonable amount of time, we'll be able to get reimbursement for our therapies. If they're for a younger population, and it turns out brain cancer is it's not young, but people are often afflicted in their 50s and early 60s, so it's an insurance population. We had insurance coverage long before we had Medicare, but older populations, so like lung cancer, that we're at the FDA right now, and we're anticipating approval for a lung cancer application at the end of the year. That's a little older. That tends to be after 65. And so we have real trepidation and concerns that it could take, again, another number of years before we can get this therapy to patients. So we don't have it, but there is legislation that we're helping to push that could provide that pathway. And that's all we want. Nobody wants guarantees. We want a pathway. Japan is not easy, but we know what we have to do, and then we can do it. And when you do it, you go down the path, and then with some degree of confidence that you can get that reimbursement.
And this is bipartisan legislation?
It is. In fact, it's called Ensuring Patient Access Critical Breakthrough Products. It's HR 1691, and it was introduced by Brad Wenstrup of Ohio, Republican, and Susan Delbini, a Democrat of Washington. And we are getting great support from, in particular, Maggie Hassel, who's worked very closely with us on her side of the aisle, to provide the support that's not just going to benefit Novocure, but it's going to benefit all the stuff that's coming out of Manchester and the Boston med tech community as well.
Yeah, right. Well, it sounds like a no-brainer to address, these delays. So, we look forward to working with you on this important piece of legislation. We're talking about saving people's lives at the end of the day. I mean, that's why I think it should be nonpartisan. It should be something that we all should agree on. Anyway, anything we can do to alleviate pain, extend a life of an individual, I just think it's something we all should be embracing. So hopefully
we're also building the industry. I mean,
and the industry.
Medical technology is one of a few industries that are still, the flagship is the US. This is where we invent these things. This is where we manufacture these things. And there have been some bad policy decisions along the way. We don't do as many of the phase 1 and phase 2 trials as we should in the US. And that's because of bad policy. First and foremost, we need to fix this reimbursement. But, I don't say this out loud. The reason I know a lot about what's going on in Rhode Island is I'm trying to help down there too. Sure. And, Brown's putting in a phase 1 cancer unit that we're really supportive of, to do more of that work in the United States. And we can, with some, just some smart bipartisan, policy adjustments. A lot of these things were just the result of unintended consequences of well-meaning things that had happened in the past. And that's, there will always be, unknown consequences. problem is in Washington today, things are stuck, as everybody knows. So it's not as easy to fix the easy things as it once was, because it's hard to do anything.
It is. Well, Bill, if you're going to have another career, I think you ought to go into running the Chamber of Commerce in New England, because you are a booster for Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, all of New England. And it's just refreshing to hear a CEO so excited about being located here because of the talent that exists here in New England. It seems like if it's going to be innovated anywhere in the country, it's going to be innovated here in New England because of the talent. But your enthusiasm is so refreshing to hear. So I just want to, again, thank you. Thank you for taking time to join me today.
And again, I am an MIT and Harvard guy,
I know that.
So what can I say,
And you're lucky and you're smart too, But needless to say, I've been so impressed by Novocure's incredible ground-breaking work, and so glad we're able to share with our audience today. I hope they found it just as informative, enlightening, and also inspiring, the work that you do. Again, the bottom line is saving people's lives. So for those of you tuning in, I do hope that you enjoyed all of our conversation today. Please be sure to join in next month when our guest will be Angela Bovell, the CEO of another incredible New England organization, Eccentric Care Alliance. Thank you.